We are live. Good evening, everyone. How are you? We're coming from the beloved community in Gwinnett County, Georgia. We have with you the Secretary of State race today. Before we start, we would like to open up with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for all that you have done and all that is in it. We ask that what we do today is pleasing to your sight. We ask that we touch hearts and minds and share some knowledge today, Lord God. Bless those who are attending. Bless those who would like to be. Lord God, we are here standing for the beloved community, reaching, teaching, loving, working together. It is in the precious name of my God, Jesus, I pray. Please pray to your God. Amen.
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 Amen. Okay. We're going to cut to the chase. We're not going to take very long. And we're going to let you both introduce yourself today. Just to lead into this, we are again the Gwinnett NAACP, and I am so proud today to have my state president, President Gerald Griggs, here sitting with us as a commentator, moderator, asking questions. How are you today, President Griggs?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for the opportunity to be involved in this, our runoff conversation with the candidates. I look forward to a robust conversation that will affect not only Gwinnett County, but the entire state of Georgia. So I'm looking forward to a lively conversation. And thank you again to the Gwinnett County branch for having me.
Thank you for your presence. Now, let's do a little housekeeping today. First of all, we want to make sure that everyone on this screen that we are all acting with one accord, and we know that we do not have to talk about the temper and of this debate. That we will all be respectful. I know that's not even necessary to be said, but to we all want to be respectful and treated accordingly. We want those when we open up our live mic to also be with one accord. We want to make sure that if you are asking a question right now, that it is not mudslinging and biased. We want this to be an above board event. So, with that being said, let's cut to the chase. And this is a historic event also today on this Democratic platform for the Secretary of State runoff in the year 2022. We are so happy to have with us two great women of stature in the state of Georgia who both have had loud voices speaking for the people. So we want you to introduce yourselves today. Let's start. We're going to start with B. B, would you please, excuse me, Representative Nguyen. We speak so much with each other. We want to make sure that everyone is coming with the same tenor. So, Representative Nguyen, would you please introduce yourself? Our questions, since we will be limited to an hour, will be with 2 minutes. We have a time stop keeper who will be running our clock. But for this introduction, we will give you 3 minutes. Please, Representative Nguyen, introduce yourself today to our NAACP and audience around the state of Georgia.
Thank you, President Poole, and thank you, President Griggs, and thank you, Dee, for being on this. We've had a pretty intense past few weeks, and so it's nice to be on with y'all tonight. I am B. Nguyen. I am a state representative for House District 89, which is Atlanta DeKalb, and I'm the daughter of Vietnamese refugees. Before my parents made it over here, my dad was actually held as a prisoner of war in what they called re-education camp, where he was in prison for 3 years. And when he was released, my parents made the difficult decision to flee their country in search of basic civil liberties. Some of those civil liberties are under attack today, like the right to free and fair elections. I grew up in Augusta, Georgia, where my parents still live today, and we had a pretty typical, quiet immigrant household upbringing in which my parents said, keep your head down, stay out of trouble, don't make any waves, and just study hard. They believed that public education was the key to getting out of poverty, and it was true for my family. But what was absent in these conversations at home was the idea of building community power, of building political power, and not for the sake of having power, but to demand better for the people that we love. And so my parents never talked about that, and they never talked about the importance of wielding your sacred, most fundamental right to vote at the ballot box. When I left home, Augusta in '99 and moved to Atlanta to go to school, I had a different pathway than what my parents envisioned for me. It was for that reason that when I finished school, I started an education nonprofit working inside of our Georgia public school systems in Atlanta and DeKalb. And that's where I saw the power of the Georgia General Assembly, their continued decision to defund our public education system, where students that I worked with were not only attending defunded schools, they didn't have access to health insurance, secure and affordable housing, healthy foods, public transit, all the things that are necessary for young people to graduate and build a successful economic future for themselves. That's why I decided to run in 2017 when my predecessor and our future governor, Stacey Abrams, stepped up to run for governor. I just finished my 5th term at the Georgia legislature, where every single year I've seen Republicans introduce a bill to make it harder for Georgians to vote. And in the beginning of those years, we were able to successfully beat those bills back, in part because of the coalitions that we built and the strong advocacy groups that we have here in the state of Georgia. But everything changed in 2020, and I think you all know why. Because there was a broad-based coalition built in Georgia that brought together Georgians from every part of our state and delivered a win in 2020. And Republicans started a concerted and coordinated effort to undermine the legitimacy of the 2020 election. They brought Rudy Giuliani and Trump's legal team into our legislature, where I took down Trump's expert witness and as a result was met with death threats. They then had Republicans sign on to the Texas lawsuit to try to overturn the results of the election. They brought alternative electors into our state capitol to try to overturn the results of the election. And then they used that moment to pass Senate Bill 202, the 98-page voter suppression bill that criminalizes handing out a bottle of water to a voter waiting in line. So this race for me is about protecting the future of our democracy, about defending every eligible voter's ability to have the freedom to vote, that when they go to the ballot box, they're able to cast their ballot, they know their vote will count, and that the results of the election are upheld. I'm running for Secretary of State to do that and to ensure that we move to the office over to the side of the people.
Okay, thank you for that. And next, just for information's sake, our timekeeper will be keeping the clock and will let us know when you are approaching the 1 minute 50-second mark when we start asking questions. Okay, and D. Dawkins-Haigler, representative, because I know you have been a state senator. Please, would you introduce yourself to the people tonight?
Mm-hmm. So good evening, everyone. Thank you, President Poole. Thank you, President Griggs. It's always good to see my opponent. We have been at this all day, and we will be like this for the next week. So a little bit about myself. I was raised in South Carolina. My mother, who's also a Secretary of State candidate right now in South Carolina, which we're very proud of her, is a retired nurse and an Army veteran, disabled. My father served in Vietnam. We're proud of that. My grandfather served in Korea, and my husband right now, who I have been with for the past 30 years, we just celebrated 29 years of marriage last week, is an active duty Army colonel stationed at Fort Gordon, and we are proud of the work he's done. We met on the campus of South Carolina State University. We have 4 children, Christopher, Kristen, Hannah, and Joshua. And so my background is in human resources, public administration, and political science, as well as being an ordained minister for 25 years. I served 9 years in the Georgia General Assembly, always fighting for human rights for everyone in the state. I served in a leadership capacity every single year that I was in the Georgia General Assembly. Upon being there less than a month, I was appointed as an assistant deputy whip. I served as the chair of the Women's Caucus, chair of the Black Caucus. So leadership is something that I'm very familiar with. I have an extensive background in nonprofit management, corporate America, as well as voting rights, which are very important to us right now in this country. I am a life member of the NAACP and have been a member of the NAACP ever since I was a teenager when I came up through the AXO program. So I understand our struggles and what we've been through. As a descendant of slaves, I know how important it is to fight for the right to vote, especially being a Black woman, knowing that we didn't even get the right to vote until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And ever since that time, I have been able to exercise my voice. Starting as a teenager, I started helping people get registered to vote, as well as helping people get elected to office. So my life has been a testament of my values and what I believe in. And so it's very important for us right now to make sure that they don't try to continue to unravel the where we've gotten to this point in time. It is so much at stake for us in the state of Georgia, understanding that the Republicans will be relentless. We make up 32% of the population, just as Black people alone. And this is why they're changing the rules of engagement, because they know that the more that we have the opportunity to vote, the more they're going to come against us to make sure that we cannot have those votes. And so experience matters. Leadership matters, and all the things that I've done up until this point has prepared me for an office of this magnitude, which has 5 different unique divisions, and it needs a corporate leader, an experienced administrator to handle those jobs that's outside of just voting in and of itself, but also in corporations, licensing, security and exchanges, and nonprofit and charities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have 2 formidable people running today. We are just glad to have you in this space. And President Griggs, I am going to let you open up our questions today for each candidate. Each candidate will be given a question, again, 2 minutes long. When we get to that 1:30 mark, we will, let you know that time is running out. And then please finish. Everyone will have ample opportunity. If there is a rebuttal, we will make sure that each person has the opportunity for rebuttal. With that being said, President Griggs,
Thank you,
what's the
President
first
Poole.
question for today?
And this question will be for both candidates, but we will start with candidate D. Dawkins-Haigler. Beyond overseeing elections, can you describe the other duties of the Secretary of State have that the average voter may not even realize?
Yes, and thank you for that question, President Griggs. Well, one of the things that people don't realize that the Secretary of State's office can do is be over security and exchanges. Many times people make investments in the state of Georgia throughout the stock market or through other things, through their 401ks and whatnot, and they're not familiar with the fact that the Secretary of State is kind of like the gatekeeper, the one to protect your investments. So let's be very clear. People are concerned about bread and butter issues. That is their number one concern, regardless of what everyone else tries to tell you. They want to make sure that they are able to have make a living and take care of their families. This is why another division is that of licensing. People are concerned, especially when people move into the state of Georgia and they cannot get their license reciprocity when they move here. They're concerned about that. This is why I want to make sure, as Secretary of State, I have an office in place that has good customer service, so that when people either move to Georgia, they'll know how to get their license renewed. And so we have to think about that. Barbers, cosmetologists, nurses, architects, engineers, funeral home directors, all of them are licensed by the Secretary of State's office. So many people don't realize that. Are you saying time is over or time? I can't.
No, that was me coughing. I apologize.
I'm sorry. Okay, and as well as making sure that corporations, many people don't know that businesses are incorporated by the Secretary of State's office. There are over 1 million businesses incorporated by the Secretary of State's
30
office.
seconds.
And many times people have to go on this maze of a website to figure out what to do, or they can't get anyone on the phone. This is why customer service is very important and key. And this is why, as a past administrator, someone who has a background in human resource management, I would make sure that that office is staffed properly so that people can have their corporations, get their licensing, because regardless of what people think, Fortune 500 companies do not fuel our economy. Our economy is fueled by small
Thank
business.
you.
And most of the people in Georgia who have small businesses need to be able to get the resources they need from the Secretary of State's office quick and in a hurry and without any type of barricades or barriers in place.
Thank you.
Thank you, candidate Dawkins-Haigler. Same question to you, candidate Nguyen. Beyond overseeing elections, can you describe the other duties of Secretary of State that the average voter may not even realize?
Sure. And I think that when we look at the Secretaries of State's office and we talk about these divisions, corporations, licensure, charities, securities, funeral, and cemeteries, I think there are two main buckets that I look at. One is economic development and opportunities for entrepreneurs, small business owners, and practitioners. How do we expand our workforce through those divisions? So we have a robust small business and entrepreneur in Georgia, where a lot of women and minority women make up the growth of the small businesses and entrepreneurship. So what would it look like if the Secretary of State is able to provide more resources to these small business owners and entrepreneurs? An example that I can give is during the pandemic, we saw that the SBA loans and PPP loans were dispersed inequitably. And a way that we can mitigate some of those inequities is to ensure that the Secretary of State is helping remove barriers. You have to have a certain level of accounting in order for you to even qualify for some of these capitals. So as Secretary of State, I would partner up with our local chambers and ensure that we are doing regional trainings so that we can do things like teach those accounting classes so that businesses can get up to speed with what they need in order for them to even apply for those loans in the first place. Around the licensure division, there are so many practitioners that rely on the Secretary of State's office, and there's a lot of opportunity to grow and expand. So certainly license reciprocity, interstate compacts, especially with workforce shortages, would enable people to move to the state of Georgia and enter into their trade or practice without barriers, but also move between states and cross state lines so they can practice in other states as well. I would also focus on removing barriers for those who have been caught up in our criminal legal system so they can obtain occupational licensures. And then for those who are moving to our country as new Americans, making sure that they're able to bring their trade and their businesses with them when they come and build their lives in the state of Georgia. So I think there's tremendous opportunity to do good with the business portion. And then on the consumer protection side, it is making sure that the people of Georgia are not investing in fraudulent charities and not investing in fraudulent securities, especially for our most vulnerable Georgians, especially for our seniors. And we can do things to ensure that the public has access to a registry of charities who are known to be fraudulent. That information is already available, and the Secretary of State should house that under the Secretary of State's office and make sure that Georgia voters know where they should invest their money and where they should not invest their money.
Thank you for that. Okay, the next question. Excuse me. Let's start with Representative Nguyen. You mentioned something about equitable distribution of funds that came through the state. One of those things for the businesses that we touched on, and both of you touched on it briefly, what types of programs, especially historically, since African American communities have not been served with licensure, businesses expanding, how would you help the African American community expand and grow and qualify for these licenses and not be so penalized in fees and other things? Just a moment. Let me make sure. Would you start, please? Thank you.
Thank you. So when I'm looking at both the corporations and licensure division, certainly equity is a key component of that, and making sure that Black Georgians and other minority-owned businesses have more opportunities and more robust opportunities. When I go onto that Secretary of State's website, one, it is not streamlined, it is not user-friendly, and it's really hard to figure out what steps you take to even create your business in the first place. I want to create a Secretary of State where we can encapsulate the most frequently asked questions through a streamlined website, through an AI chat, so that, for instance, if you feel hesitant about picking up the phone and connecting with a real person, then some of those barriers and anxieties are removed. And part of that is making sure that business owners and entrepreneurs have access to the right information. I know so many folks, when they're creating their LLCs or the businesses, they hire LegalZoom. They pay for a registered agent, things that don't necessarily have to take place and cost more money. So we can create confidence and invest in the education and the outreach by regional trainings, by partnering up with Black chambers across the state of Georgia, by equipping small business owners and entrepreneurs with what they need in order for them not only to start their business, but access their capital, which I mentioned one of the barriers before was an accounting class. I mean, that when you think about a small business or an entrepreneur, it is hard to figure out the financial components and have those pieces in place. So making sure the Secretary of State's office is proactive in that. I would also look at some of the barriers that are in place for creativity. So when I was in Savannah, I visited a barber and he told me he was learning how to run his business during a pandemic and he had gone down to one chair. And he pointed out that there was nobody who gave him the right information to ensure that he was keeping his customers safe.
Representative Nguyen?
Okay. Or himself safe. So simply investing in the video and then allowing him to be creative. He wanted to do mobile haircuts, which is not allowed in the state of Georgia, but we allow mobile grooming for pets. So that's one example.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Representative D. Dawkins-Haigler.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. So one of the things that I have been doing throughout this campaign, and even when I ran 4 years ago, is to talk about equity in the disbursement of funds as it relates to Black businesses. So Black business owners are suffering similar to the way Black people suffer with voter suppression. We're often kept out of the system. It's not that Black people don't have good accounting systems, it's that Black people have not been given the resources that they need to do the job that they have. And sometimes they're kept from having certain education, which is not education, but education and resources that is important. Let me give you an example. In 2018, when I ran for Secretary of State, I talked about how women should have resources dedicated to them through the Secretary of State's office, to have trainings and webinars through people who have expertise, through the SBA, through other corporate America, top-notch individuals who could do this training. Well, as a result, Brad Raffensperger created a program called She Leads, and that helps women to scale up their businesses. This election, I have talked nothing about that, but more so about how do African Americans, how do Black people scale up their businesses? What can the Secretary of State's office do that they have now done similar to the She Leads program? They can do the same thing. African Americans make up 32% of this population. You have to have the political will to do right. But when you are in a group of people who have been historically oppressed in a system, you understand how to fight back and when to fight back, because you see some of the nuances that many other people may not be able to pick up on because they have not been a part of that group that has been historically oppressed in a state. And so I would want to make sure that there is a dedicated task force in the state of Georgia, again, that will deal specifically with Black people trying to scale up their businesses or to start businesses. And that last part, you can waive some of these fees. The fees that are not specifically set by, that is not a legislature set fee. The Secretary of State can go in and work with the fees that they are assessing to people for applying for a license. They can explain to them that you may not have to have a registered agent, that you have to pay. All of this stuff is things.
Representative Dawkins, your time is up.
Sorry, that's what I was
okay. That's okay. Because we just have this hour, we want to try to get in as many questions. You women are doing a wonderful job in compacting these answers. Thank you. So we talked a little bit about business. Let's move over to that voting side again, because we all know about SB 202 and all the restrictive measures that have been taken to keep us from being able to use our willpower in being able to vote. One of the things that has been happening in Georgia is the purging of voters. If a person who is registered to vote does not vote in 2 consecutive national elections in Georgia, they are purged. Let's start with you, Representative Dawkins. How would you work with this, the purging, and what changes would you bring to this legislative action?
Mhm. So the purging of votes is something that we have been dealing with in the state of Georgia for quite some time. In 2008, I brought it to the attention of the General Assembly that the purging of votes had started happening under Karen Handel. And I told them then we have to be proactive, because if not, this was going to be the trajectory of something that was going to continue down the road and become even larger as we progress. By the time Brian Kemp became the Secretary of State, and I was the chair of the Black Caucus, we started witnessing massive numbers of people being purged from the voter file. So what did I do? As the chair of the Black Caucus, I brought in Brian Kemp and told him that this was not acceptable and he would not be doing it on my watch. And then we kept putting up all of these things to make sure that Black people understood what was happening in the state of Georgia. Hence the reason I introduced legislation even back then for same-day voter registration, to try to target or combat what he was doing as it related to purging people from the voting file. So this is not something new that people had just started doing. I tried to tackle this early on. So one of the things that we could do to make sure, because you have to, their rationale is cleaning up the voter file. What I would want to do is move voters into an inactive file, which means simply they may not be on the main database file, but in the event that they go to a polling place and they don't understand the whole process of purging, their names will still be over here in this inactive file that someone would just be able to type in. And this is just a matter of the right programming so that it would come up. And if they have not committed any crimes, any felonies, or they're just here in the state of Georgia and all they did was move from one place to another, or just decided they didn't want to vote in the last previous elections, they still would have the right to vote in that current election. That's why leadership matters, when you understand the intricacies of how this entire purging situation works. And we know that every time we get the right to vote, they just try to change the rules on us each and every time. And we just have to be a little bit smarter than they are as it relates to the purging of voter files.
Thank you, Representative. And Representative Nguyen?
Sure. And I agree with a lot of what has been said. Voter purging has been a tool that Republicans under the Secretary of State currently and previously under Kemp and Handel used to massively remove hundreds of thousands of Georgians and up to millions of Georgians off the voter rolls, and especially targeting Black and Brown Georgians. One of the things that I did as a lawmaker was introduce legislation to end the inactive use it or lose it policy, because I do not believe as a value or a principle that if you sit out on an election cycle, your vote should be taken away. That is an individual's choice to sit out on that election cycle. In terms of the way that the voter maintenance is handled, we have to make sure that we are changing the mechanisms by which the Secretary of State is cleaning up the voter rolls. So under federal and state law, we've got to remove people who have died or who have moved out of state. And the mechanism that the SOS uses is inherently flawed. Every year, there are voters who are erroneously removed. One of the things that the Secretary of State does is if you send a piece of mail out to a voter and for some reason the mail gets sent back to you, they peg you as inactive, even if you haven't moved. And there have been people who have been wrongly removed from the voter rolls. So ensuring there's an accurate process so people aren't erroneously removed from the voter rolls, but also ensuring that the Secretary of State invests in good faith communication. Sending out one postcard in the mail is not sufficient, especially when it comes to taking away somebody's right to vote. That means phone calls, that means text messaging, that means letters in the mail, and it means releasing the list as soon as practically possible so the public knows, so that NAACP chapters know, so the county parties know, so that people can work in tandem to notify these voters in good faith. I don't see why the Secretary of State wouldn't invest in that. The other night I was sleeping and my cell phone was buzzing in the middle of the night because it was an Amber Alert. When we are talking about taking somebody's fundamental right to vote away, we should, at the very minimum, invest in technology that we already have in place.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Again, we will now turn questions over to President Griggs.
And thank you again for allowing me to ask a question. One of the biggest underserved populations that we aren't really talking about in increasing voter turnout is individuals 18 to 35. How would you use your role as Secretary of State to increase voter turnout among this young demographic of voter who seems to be as less engaged as our older population? That question will first go to candidate Nguyen.
Thanks for asking that question, President Griggs. I think it's an incredibly important one, especially because yesterday afternoon, as we were marching to urge the legislative body in Georgia to pass common sense gun reform, it was a lot of young people who were showing up in our streets and demanding that we see those changes at the state capitol. And what we saw in this last primary cycle was the majority of voters, the vast majority, over 80% of voters who turned up were over the age of 50. So we have got to engage our young people and help them understand the power of their vote and how it translates into electoral power and how it translates into policy power. Part of that is meeting young voters where they are, ensuring that we are educating them and doing the outreach that we need to do so that we can get some face-to-face time with them. I remember being a young voter and being disconnected, not just from the political process, but also from the candidates themselves. And part of that work has to do with ensuring that in our school system, we are investing in civics, that we are producing and creating programs to register students to vote, but also equip them with the necessary information that they need in order to vote. And then using different and creative ways to connect with voters. So for instance, one of the ways that I have seen New Georgia Project work with young voters is meeting them where they are. Every year they have a gaming day where gamers come in and they play games. One day I came in and played Mario Kart with Insei Ufo, and gamers will come in because of that interest. But then at the same time, we talk about the importance of voting. We talk about the importance of mobilizing, and we show young people that we're interested and we're invested. And as Secretary of State, I would work with organizations like Georgia Association of Educators and our voting rights group to reach more young people and to bring them to the table to ensure that they understand the importance and power of their voices.
Thank you, candidate Nguyen. Candidate D. Dawkins-Haigler, same question. How would you engage 18 to 35-year-olds through your role as Secretary of State to turn out to vote?
Thank you. And that's a very good question. That's one of the things that I've been doing the majority of my life. And let's just think about how people even got involved in voting in the first place, especially as African Americans. When we think about leaders like Congressman John Lewis, when we still can't get a voting rights bill passed in his honor, or Jesse Jackson, most of them started when they were young. And so I have as well started when I was young. As a matter of fact, Jesse Jackson endorsed my campaign the first time and the second time. And so when you think about young people and how they get engaged, they first have to know that you care and that you're authentic and that you're actually in the communities with them, not someone who is just having talking points, or people who just come by every now and then when it's campaign season, but people who are entrenched in the community. Because once young people understand that you care, they will go out and do the necessary things. And they feel like their votes have been taken for granted over the last few years, that when they do get engaged, when they do get in the process, people will go and do the exact opposite. The Secretary of State's office has a budget in the communications office where they can dedicate it to making sure that young people understand the importance of voting and why they should vote, and to target those communities directly. The Secretary of State, instead of continuing to propel this lie that there might be some voter fraud in the state, they can do the same thing like we do and go into the schools. Like, for instance, I am in numerous organizations, Delta Sigma Theta, National Council of Negro Women, the 100 Black Women, Top Ladies of Distinction. And what we do is we go into public schools. We start when children are in high school, around 9th and 10th grade, and we talk to them all the time about, the importance of voting. But what do you want to see us do as adults? Do we talk to you, or do we speak with you? And what is the dialogue? And there's a big difference between talking to someone and speaking with someone. And so they're able to then tell us what they want to see and how democracy should look like. And so this is not a one-off for me. This is something that I have dedicated my life to, as well as giving money to organizations that do important work. That's what I've done, a track record of doing that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You ladies have been very cooperative. We're checking in our chat. Please, if you have questions, we want to make sure that you get an opportunity to ask them. I'm not sure what that was just now. Did we have a question?
It looked like it was a question.
I saw some of it, President Poole. I think it said something about the Secretary of State removing
Well, I think he can
information.
put it back up there so we could read it.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Let's read that out loud for you. I noticed that the Secretary of State has removed the elected officials who represent you from the MVP page. Will you restore that? And I'll read that again. I noticed that the Secretary of State has removed the elected officials who represent you from the MVP page. Will you restore that? Okay. Representative Nguyen, would you like to answer first? Go ahead.
Sure. So the Secretary of State recently changed the My Voter page interface, and it is not as user friendly as what it used to be. And it's created a lot of confusion, especially during a major election cycle. I actually think that page should be rebuilt entirely so that it is easily accessible to voters. It's not just removing critical information, it's really, really hard to find. I actually did see my state representatives under the MVP page when I was last on it. So I don't know if it's a function of they removed it altogether or they just changed where they kept it. But absolutely, I think that voters should have access to knowing who currently represents them and that the information should be easily accessible. The other information that should be easily accessible is being able to get your sample ballot. The current Secretary of State's office requires you to disable a pop-up blocker both on your computer and your phone, even to just see the sample ballot itself. And the entire the SOS page, period, needs to be user friendly in such a way that when any voter gets on there, they can find the critical information. What I like about this ticker that has been running at the bottom of our screen is it provides really critical information. We are in a June runoff election cycle, and many voters don't have the information that they need in order to make sure that they, one, know there's an election, where to go to vote, when the voting days and hours are. And we know tomorrow, Monday, the 13th, early voting will start for all counties. Gwinnett, y'all did a really great job of early voting, had Saturday and Sunday voting, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., but all counties have been different. And so making sure that those websites are user-friendly, accessible, and have all the critical information that voters need.
Okay, thank you for that. And do I need to read that again, Candidate Haigler? Thank you.
No, I have it. Thank you. And so what I would like to say is the Secretary of State needs to make sure that they, first of all, have good customer service and that they are competent enough to make sure that the website is doing what it needs to do. But let's be very clear. If it is not showing up, it's not just that the website in itself sometimes is chaotic. They rush to have these elections. And then in the midst of redistricting, instead of being able to effectively show people where they live, what district they were going to be in, it created a system of chaos because they wanted to rush this election for whatever reason they wanted to do it. So what is probably going on is that they're trying to still put people in the right district so that they'll know who their representatives are for just about everything from the top of the ballot to the bottom. But that being said, that website created nothing but chaos because who changes an entire website a couple of months going to a major election like we are? These things are done by design. And as Black people, we understand how things are done by design because it's been done to us since the inception of this country. From the time many of them kidnapped us and brought us over here, we have seen all of the trickery that goes on around the building out of websites, funneling information to communities of color, making sure people understand when to do it, how to do it. It should not be a maze. It should be there on the front face so everyone can understand what they need to do and how they need to do it. And so, yes, so to answer the question, yes, I will restore it to make sure that it's there, but it probably is just in the midst of some confusion right now because they're probably trying to figure out how to reset the website because they don't have enough competent people running the office right now. This is why you had people, I'll leave it right there. But that's part of the problem, making sure you have good customer service.
Okay, thank you both for that. We have another question coming up. And this is from Cheryl Brannon. Part of an opportunity for improvement in the state is more polling places, as there are often long lines which can frustrate a voter who does not have the intestinal fortitude to stand in line for a long time. what will you do to increase the number of polling places? Let's start with Representative um, Hagler. Thank you. Can you see that or?
I'm trying my best, and the reason why I keep taking them on and off is I didn't want y'all to see the glare of my glasses, but that is so little, and I'm trying to.
And I'll be happy to read it again if you need to.
I mean,
Okay.
the basic of the question is, what will you do to increase the number of polling places is the question.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for that, President Grigg. So basically, let's just be honest. What we have witnessed historically is that many times where there is urban populations or a large population of African American people, they have not always had the number of voting machines available and accessible to them. And so this is why it's key that the Secretary of State work with all 5,900 boards of election to make sure that they have what they need so that on the day of the election, they will know how many machines they need to carry out the duty so people can have access to free and fair elections. Again, like I said from the beginning of this conversation, most of this is because you have to have the political will and the foresight to make sure that you want everyone to vote. This is why the NAACP is important, and we've been fighting forever around voting rights issues, because people who are in places of leadership have to make voting accessible to all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, nationality. If you are a United States citizen, a Georgia citizen, you should have access to the polling place. This is why that bill they passed, SB 202, was dangerous, because long lies sometimes will deter people. Another form of voter suppression. And the people when you couldn't give out a bottle of water, that was mostly to Black churches. That was with Black people giving out bottles of water, and they were just trying to penalize again Black people who were trying to make it easy for people to be able to come into the polling place to express their right to vote. So basically, we would have to continue to be a little smarter. Set up cooling stations down the street, give out bags of food and water down the street. Whatever trick they come up with, we got to be one step further to make sure that we can overcome that.
Thank you. Excellent question. Representative Nguyen?
Sure. I don't believe that any voter should have to wait in line for 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, 11 hours, which is what has been happening in the state of Georgia. And certainly part of ensuring that we have more polling places is to equip our local election boards with the resources that they need to carry out free, fair, and efficient elections in all 159 of our counties. That means being able to negotiate the funding from the state budget, but also being a leader on garnering other mechanisms where we can draw down money, which is federal funding from the Help America Votes Act, and which is also these private grant funds that were instrumental in 2021 and in 2020. It also means supporting our local election boards. Our current Secretary of State continues to throw our local election boards under the bus. We need a leader who will come to the table and help mitigate those challenges so we can ensure that our local election boards have the polling locations that they need in place and they have the equipment that they need in place so that voters are not waiting in line. I would also say that the second way in which we can participate and ensure that we're advocating for polling places is through the law on the books that currently says if 20% of registered voters in that polling precinct, they do not want their location to close, the state election boards, the local election boards are not able to close them. In Randolph County, I went down there when 7 out of 9 polling locations were slated to close and worked out of the local NAACP office without access to internet, without access to Vote Builder, so we could go door to door and collect signatures. When we were going door to door in Randolph County to collect signatures to save this voting location, every voter we talked to said they do not want their polling place closed. They do not want to travel further. So using that law that says if 20% of voters say no, making sure that we're working and organizing with other voting rights advocates to reach out to voters and let them know if you sign a petition, they can't close your polling location. And the last thing is not using the investigators to go out and intimidate people while they're waiting in line, and not using investigators to intimidate poll workers if groups are handing out bottles of water.
Thank you, Representative Nguyen. And the Gwinnett NAACP needs to make a statement in this slot right now, especially with this question. In Gwinnett County, in an area that has been inequitably served with resources in places. There was a polling place that needed to be built. The Gwinnett NAACP brought it to the attention of the Board of Registrations and Elections. And at this time, they have been non responsive to this request, non responsive to building a location that is very much needed because the people are not being served. There was no effort to get that polling place during the primaries and nonpartisan elections. So please contact the Gwinnett NAACP so that we can give you details about what we are talking about. We have put this to Zach Manifold, the election supervisor, who has not gotten back to us about this required location that has not been put in place. So we want to make a statement right now that the Board of Registration and Elections in Gwinnett County, their supervisor, as well as the uh, the uh, the director for community services, has ignored the polling place that is needed and has refused to build this location in the eastern section of Gwinnett County. You're hearing that from your Gwinnett NAACP. Okay. Are there other questions from the audience? I know this is the same person. We're trying to see if other people have questions. Okay, here we have one from CJF. Some licensing departments, such as used auto dealers and used auto parts, are controlled by two companies. How can your office increase companies that provide training and resources? Uh, let's see. Let's try this again. That question, I'm not sure. Rather than read that question, we still have others that we have. Please look for our live feed for more questions. But I do have one that I wanted to ask, and it's in that vein again about giving people the opportunity to vote. We know that, excuse me, what measures, the question is, what measures will you take in your role as Secretary of State to help formerly incarcerated individuals who are eligible to vote, um, and to make them aware that they can vote? Let's start with Representative Dawkins Haigler. Again, let me read this again. What measures will you take in your role as Secretary of State to help formerly incarcerated individuals who are ineligible to vote and who are unaware that they can vote? We find this a lot when we're doing voter registration across the country. Representative D. Dawkins-Haigler, please.
Thank you for that question. So prior to me running for office, I used to be chair of the Juvenile Parole Board for the state of South Carolina. And one of the things I did then was making sure that people understood how to get your rights reinstated when and if you completed all the requirements. Now, fast forward to Georgia. I have been spending the majority of my time helping people who have been previously incarcerated restore their voting rights. So one of the things that I do is I go into the jail systems, I go into the prison systems, and so it's based on whatever your offense is. So I start educating and training them even before they get out. Once they get out, what I do is I work with many of the different reintegration systems to help people who rights were taken away from them. So it's basically education. So I think the Secretary of State's office has to do a better job of educating people because when you go into communities, because I do a lot of work in the communities themselves, walking the streets, talking to people, and I'm like, are you registered to vote? Well, I can't vote. Why do you say that? Because I went to jail. Well, do you owe any restitution? No. Okay. Did you meet all the requirements of your probation? Yes. Then you can have your rights restored. So what I do sometimes is I go with them to help them walk them through the process of what it looks like to have your rights restored. So it's more like you have to be active and give them the information. So the Secretary of State's office can also have bullet points that are on their website, like many other states do, to tell people how to have your rights restored once you have completed all the necessary things based on your your guidelines for you to be reinstated to be a full citizen of whatever state that you're in. In this case, it's the state of Georgia.
Thank you for that. Representative Nguyen?
Thanks for asking that question. In 2020, I was a poll monitor at CT Martin, and a man walked up to me and he said, "Hey, I was incarcerated. I've been recently released. Can I use this as a form of ID, the state issue card from the prison in which he served?" And I said, "Yes, that is an acceptable form of ID." He then went inside the precinct and he came back out and he was very frustrated. And he said, "I've been denied the right to vote." And I got on the phone with voter protection. We were trying to figure out what was going on. As it turns out that he was denied the right to vote because he was still on probation and owed fines and fees. We've got to change that law in Georgia. It will require legislative passage, but that is something we absolutely have to take off the books. Georgia is one of the highest states and in the nation for carceral control because of the system of fees and probation that has been used to disenfranchise voters, specifically Black voters. So we've got to make that legislative change. The second piece of this is in the state of Georgia, we also have a really arbitrary law in our Constitution. It says if you are 18 or older, you can vote. If you're a citizen, you are able to vote. And then it says, however, if you have committed a crime of moral turpitude, you're not able to vote. We do not have a legal definition of moral turpitude. It is an arbitrary term. It is used arbitrarily to disenfranchise voters, depending on who is in leadership and what their will is. So as Secretary of State, I would work with the Attorney General's office. I would change that process altogether. We need to allow anybody who has served their time to be able to vote. And that is a way in which the SOS can change that arbitrary moral turpitude law.
Thank you for that. Okay, let's go back to our chat. Do we have any other questions coming in through our chat? Okay, Ms. Brandon again. I experienced a poll worker asking me for one form of identification when the law allows for 7 forms of identification to vote. How would you make sure poll workers share accurate information with voters when voting? Let's start with Representative Nguyen.
Thanks for the question, Cheryl. I've actually witnessed a number of times poll workers accidentally disenfranchising voters as well because the laws are nuanced. They change very quickly. It's hard to retain poll workers. And so absolutely, as Secretary of State, one of the responsibilities and duties is to ensure that there is efficient training across the board in all of our counties so poll workers are not accidentally disenfranchising voters. The second piece of it is ensuring the Secretary of State itself has a role in the voter communication and outreach, which also includes letting voters know what are the forms of acceptable ID that voters can use when they go to the ballot box. And so as Secretary of State, I would invest both on the election board side for the training, but also within the division so that the Secretary of State can communicate to voters what they need to go to the polls and what forms of ID they can use to vote, but also voting hours and locations. And finally, I would say that legislatively, what we would also need to do is expand the number of documents that are acceptable in order for a Georgian to get a driver's license, a driver card, or an ID. When we're talking about people who have been formerly incarcerated, people who are facing homelessness, people who are here on a temporary visa, people who are unable to get forms of identification, we've got to expand the documents that are acceptable so that people can have ID in the first place.
Thank you. And Representative Dawkins-Haigler, please.
Mm-hmm. And so what we know is that education is the key. But again, it depends on which polling place that you go to because people are trained differently. There needs to be a systematic way in which voters, poll workers are trained through the state of Georgia. I have noticed that things are different in one county versus another. And so the Secretary of State still has the obligation of being the chief election officer in this state to make sure that each individual county has trained their workers properly. And many workers now, it's going to be hard trying to find them because they are being threatened by all of these right-wing groups, people who are sending death threats to them and telling them they're going to oversee them or stress them out. And many poll workers now don't even want to be bothered with it. But the Secretary of State still has to make sure that people understand their distinct roles and which type of identifications are acceptable. And then the average voter has to also be educated on that. We have spent so much time over the last 15 years trying to keep people from voting. This is the Secretary of State's office. Instead of giving them all the resources, and I mean Georgia voters, all the resources that they need to be able to understand the entire voting system in this state. And this could be done along the way. The Secretary of State's office has a budget, a public communications budget that can be used for such things, but you have to have the political will to want to do right, to make sure that your voters understand how to vote, when to vote. Is, for instance, there should be some type of information that is sent out, at the beginning of the year, said these are the elections that are coming up this year. This is the type of identification that you need. This is where you can find information about your polling places. This is where you can find information about who represents you. This is where you can find information about the different political parties we have. This is the process of how you run for office. This is the process down, all the way down the list. But you have to have the will to want to do that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm glad to have been endorsed by Jesse Jackson, because he is one of the key fighters that this country knows that has made sure, whether it was for Motor Voter, a Help America Vote Act, and all the like, trying to make sure that all citizens in this country have the right to vote. And I'm glad that I have been working hard and diligent on this issue for upward of almost 30 years.
Thank you for that. Again, both of you women, just a wealth of knowledge this evening. Uh, Many people usually put the Secretary of State's office in a box, but it's so much more than that. And we know that you've had long days, so we're going to be true to our word. And it's not our usual 90 minutes, but we're going to be wrapping this up shortly. So while we're getting prepared to wrap this up, we want you to start thinking about those elevator speeches. We will give you 3 minutes for those speeches because we want you to tell us why we need to choose or elect you to represent the people in the November election. So, as you get ready, President Grigg, are there any comments that you'd like to make? Any last remarks regarding this? Uh,
Yes.
you have the mic.
Sure. And thank you again for allowing the Georgia State Conference to be a part of this. We are appreciative of both of the candidates for offering themselves for service to this great state of Georgia. Look forward to making sure we get people out to vote on the 21st. We already have started early voting. As President Poole has said, congratulations to both candidates. You will be exceptional in service to this great state, and we look forward to seeing you in November. And those are all the comments I have, and we will continue to push people to the polls to make sure they're educated voters.
Okay, and Representative Nguyen, we're losing sight of you. Can you hear us at this time? Okay. We're not sure what has happened with her audio. While here, she is again. Great, great.
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
Well, we have you back. And again, as we are prepared to close out, I hope everybody can see that I voted in the early in-person voting. We need you all to come out, cast that ballot, tell your friends, your neighbors, your spouses, come out there because runoffs usually have low turnouts, but we're not going to let that be it on this watch. We need you to come and cast your ballot, let your voice be known. We want to also just quick announcements, invite you to the NAACP's Juneteenth event that will be held in Norcross on June 19th. That's Sunday, June 19th in Thrasher Park. Come on out and find out who we are, what we're doing. We are partnering with the city of Norcross, and we're looking forward to a wonderful time. Both of you candidates, please feel free to come out. and say a word to the people. Okay, so with this, we will give you 3 minutes for your elevator speeches. And again, we thank you for being our guests, wonderful guests, very open, candid, and showing the people yourself. Candidate Nguyen, if you would start, please.
Thank you so much, President Poole and President Griggs, for having us on tonight. I'm Nguyen. I'm running for Georgia's Secretary of State. And for me, this race is about the future of our democracy and making sure that we protect the freedom to vote for every eligible Georgian. I've been a state lawmaker for the past 5 years, and I've witnessed Georgia Republicans attack our fundamental right to vote and erode our democracy. And I have stood up at every turn to fight back against this voter suppression that we're seeing, including taking on Rudy Giuliani and Trump's legal team, even in the face of death threats. I have gone toe-to-toe with Brad Raffensperger, and I'm prepared to beat him in November. Georgia voters need to remember that Brad Raffensperger is not our friend. He is currently running his campaign based on conspiracy theories, including the alleged idea that non-citizens are voting, which they are not, and including the idea that Georgia citizens are ballot harvesting, which they are not. I am really proud to be endorsed by Stacey Abrams, by Mayor Andre Dickens, by Mayor Hardy Davis from my hometown of Augusta, Georgia, but as well as our organizing groups like Georgia Equality, Georgia Association of Educators, and Georgia AFL-CIO labor unions. We have to build a broad-based coalition to ensure that we deliver a defeat in November so that we can get rid of Brad Raffensperger. He has not been a friend to our democracy, and I am prepared to go toe-to-toe with him in November. I'm Nguyen. I'm running for Secretary of State to ensure that we have free, fair, and efficient elections in all 159 counties and to ensure that we protect the freedom to vote for every eligible Georgian. Thank you so much for having me on. President Poole, you already said that early voting has started in Gwinnett. Y'all started this past weekend, and we'll have early voting Monday through Friday. And then every single county beginning tomorrow will have early voting Monday, June 13th through Friday, June 17th. And on election day, please remember that you must go to your voting precinct. That polls are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And if you are in line by 7 p.m., you have the right to vote. The deadline has already passed to apply for an absentee ballot. So if you planned on voting by mail, you haven't applied, you must now show up in person. My website is beeforgeorgia.com, BEEFOR, Georgia spelled out.com. Thank you so much for having me on. And thank you again, Gwinnett and NAACP.
Thank you. You're welcome. Candidate D. Dawkins-Haigler.
So thank you again for having us tonight. It's good to see you, President Griggs. It's good to see you, President Poole. We are at our watershed moment in America, and in particular in Georgia. We have always had to deal as Black people historically with people trying to take away our rights to vote, especially for me as a Black woman, understanding that when my mother was born, the right to vote for Black women was still not intact in this country. Black women did not even get the right to vote till 1965. And these are the things that my grandmother and my mother explained to me of why I had to be the one to continue to carry the mantle. And so I have been doing that all of my adult life, and even starting as a teenager, because I understand the fundamental principles of people trying to suppress our vote at every turn. But we cannot stop it. We cannot turn back. This is why my mother and grandmother made sure that I joined the NAACP at an early age, because freedom is not free. So it didn't matter whether people were burning crosses in our yards for my grandmother being an activist, or me getting death threats on TV, or even to the point now that I have to tell my daughters, who I'm afraid of some days, to carry weapons, that they had to get a Georgia permit carry because their mother is so vocal in the movement. But I will not stop. And while I have been endorsed by every other candidate that was in this race, against me and be winning, that is not the most important thing right now. And while over 100 elected officials and faith leaders have endorsed me, that's important, and I appreciate that too. But what matters the most is that whoever stands up against Brad Raffensperger in November has to be the most equipped and ready for this race. Leadership and experience matters, because this position does not come with training wheels, and it does not come with instructions. And what they're going to do is they're going to throw everything at whoever the candidate is. And I am ready on day one, because I have been battle tested. I have been battle tested because my husband is an Army colonel in the Army, and I had to have go through aggressive background checks because he is now the chief information officer for the entire United States Army. So we have to make sure that whoever we put up, when they are ready to go up against Brad Raffensperger, things will not come up and they are ready to go to work on day one. I have fought breast cancer. I have fought COVID when they said that I was not going to live. In the same way that I fought for my life, I'm going to fight for every last one of you, just as though I was fighting for one of my children. Because I cannot go through another generation where my granddaughter is going to have to deal with the exact same things that my grandmother did. We have to stop this now. And so it is incumbent upon us to do all that we can right now to continue the mantle of what has been given to us. And so I'm glad to be a life member of the NAACP. And even if I'm not elected, but I believe I will be, I'm going to continue to do what I've been doing every single day of my adult life. And that is fighting so that everyone can have the right to vote. Voter suppression is real. And we know that voter fraud for the most part is fake. And it's been created just to keep Black people from voting. But we're going to stand together and make sure that everybody, when D. Dawkins-Haigler is Secretary of the State of Georgia, has that right to free and fair elections and access to the ballot box. This is not about a coronation. This is about the people who are descendants of slaves who were brought here against our will, being able to have all of the things that American Constitution say that we should be able to have, and that's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Representative,
so I thank you. I am D. Dawkins-Haigler, running for Georgia Secretary of State, and I will do everything I can to make sure that we all get to freedom together. Thank you.
On behalf of PAC Chair, Vice President Edward Paul, our Secretary, Adrian Johnson, and all of the people who worked hard to bring this to you today, the Gwinnett NAACP thanks you greatly for your participation, for your enthusiasm and fire, and we wish both of you well on June 21st, 2022. We know that we will be prepared for the Secretary of State's office. Thank you. With that, we're going to say good evening. Again, from Edward Paul, our first Vice President, Chair of our PAC, and Adrian Johnson, and all of the people who are working hard right now, calling, texting, canvassing to let you know about this runoff election and this vote. We want to say Godspeed, blessings from the beloved community here in Gwinnett. Blessings, good night.